Hey everyone, this is going to be the last video lecture for the semester and for the course. It's going to include the material that's in Putnam's Philosophy in Our Mental Life, but really I'm only using that essay for one thing that's in it, and that's this example that Putnam gives of trying to explain why a round peg fits through the round hole but doesn't fit through the square hole. And so I'm really only using the Putnam piece for that one example. That's going to be a part of the larger territory that I'm going to cover today. And I'm going to largely speak just from my own perspective today. I've already posted on Blackboard, or not political, but I've already sent out a mass email to all of you with links pertaining to stuff that I've done recently and for a general audience, that is for a non-specialist audience, that touches on some of the issues I'm going to talk about today. All right. This unit, of course, as you know, is on the subject of psychological explanation, and specifically how we should think of folk psychological explanations, by which, again, remember, we mean explanations of our behavior in terms of various beliefs, desires, and other mental states characterized in ordinary language. Right? Sometimes these are referred to as belief desire explanations. Sometimes they're referred to folk psychological explanations. Sometimes they're referred to as common sense explanations. Each of these has a somewhat of a different connotation and maybe more or less accurate, depending upon which parts of it we're talking about. I will use them interchangeably. And it should be understood that up until about, I would say, the 1960s, it was almost uniformly thought that whatever folk psychological explanations are, whatever they're doing, whatever we want them for, it's very different to what scientific / causal explanations are doing, right? So when we offer a causal explanation for some event, so take an event, let's say the event we want to explain is that the 8-ball rolled into the corner pocket. And suppose that the explanation I give is that, well, the 8-ball was struck by the cue ball, and it was the cue ball striking the 8-ball that made the 8-ball go into the corner pocket. What I'm essentially doing is I'm explaining, right, one event in terms of an antecedent event that is or was sufficient for the initial event, right? So I have an event to be explained, 8-ball going into the pocket, and my explanation it appeals to the cause of that event, and what that cause is another event, an antecedent event that was sufficient for the subsequent event, typically under or satisfying the relevant counterfactual, right? So the point is that when I say that it's the cue ball striking the 8-ball that caused the 8-ball to go into the corner pocket, what I'm saying is that the cue ball striking the 8-ball was sufficient to make the 8-ball go into the pocket. And when I say satisfy the relevant counterfactuals, what I mean is had the cue ball not struck the 8-ball, the 8-ball would not have gone into the corner pocket, right? Up until about the 1960s, it was the general view in philosophy that whatever it is we are trying to do when we give folk psychological explanations for behaviors, it isn't anything like that. We're not trying to offer the antecedent events that were sufficient to yield the subsequent events satisfying the relevant counterfactuals. I'm not going to go into the sort of different accounts of what folk psychological explanations are doing in the view of philosophers prior to the 1960s. But the view, the pre 1960s view was largely on this was largely dominated by the thought of the later Wittgenstein, specifically the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations, and then by people in the social sciences and the philosophy of social sciences who were sort of followers of Wittgenstein, the most famous being Peter Winch. Let me just make sure I get the title of this right. Peter Winch in a very famous book called "On the Very Idea of a Social," or "On the Idea of a Social Science," which I want to say that if you search for it online, it can be found there easy to find. Free PDFs of the entire book can be found online. If you want to get a picture of sort of pre-1960s, largely Wittgenstein-inspired views on what exactly it is we're doing when we give accounts of human behavior in terms of various intentional states like beliefs and desires. Now, in the 1960s, a very, very influential paper by the philosopher Donald Davidson called Actions, Reasons, and Causes came out. But Davidson was already continuing a tradition that that began with a movement that started with Elizabeth Anscombe, in which Davidson argues that actually we should think of reasons as causes, right? So let's just make sure we're clear on this lingo. When I say, so let's not take a human behavior and a folk psychological account of it, right? When I say that, I tell you that Johnny, who's in middle school, went to the mall, and you ask, well, why did Johnny do that? And I tell you, well, Johnny's 13 years old, obviously not old enough to drive a car, and yet old enough to where he's starting to get interested in girls, and he believed that there are a lot of girls in the mall, and he really wants to meet girls, and so he had his parents drop him off at the mall, right? A very common account. You could give this sort of account for every manner of run-of-the-mill, mundane human behavior. Why did so-and-so go to the movie theater? Why did so-and-so go to the supermarket? Why did so-and-so answer the door? So-and-so, so on and so forth, right? But let's use this example. And I've used this example before, and then I have variations on it that are help to illustrate various aspects that I want to draw our attention to. So I give you this sort of account of Johnny's behavior, of Johnny getting on of Johnny being taken, dropped off at the mall. Now, the normal way of speaking of what I've just done in my account is that I've given you Johnny's reasons for going, right? Right, and the reasons come down to belief that there are girls in the mall, desire to meet girls in the mall, and therefore going to the mall, okay? So the belief and the desires comprise the reasons for going to the mall. The wanting to meet girls, the belief that there are girls in the mall, those are the reasons for Johnny going to the mall. Now, to return to what we were talking about from the beginning, and that is, how should we think of these sort of folk psychological accounts relative to their behaviors? Should we think of them as causal explanations? Now, if we were to think of them as causal explanations, then the reasons, in this case, the belief and the desire, we need to be able to think of them as causes. So is the belief that there are girls in the mall a cause of Johnny's behavior? Is the desire to meet girls a cause of Johnny's behavior? Pre-Davidson, roughly, so pre-1960s, roughly, the answer was no. Reasons are not causes. And whatever the sort of psychological account we're giving does, it doesn't give a causal explanation. Therefore, by the way, doesn't give a scientific explanation, because scientific explanations are causal explanations. Post-Davidson, most philosophers are going to say, yes, reasons are causes, and therefore we should think of this folk psychological account as a causal explanation of Johnny's behavior, and thus as a scientific explanation of Johnny's behavior. That, of course, then is the view of Fodor, that we should think of folk psychological events as causes of behavior, and that we should think, therefore, of folk psychology as a science. We know the critique, right, from Churchland. Granted, reasons are supposed to be causes. Granted, folk psychological explanations are supposed to be cause explanations. Granted, folk psychology is a science, but it's a bad one. More precisely, the Churchlands are saying it's a dated one. Folk psychology should be thought of like astrology and epicycles and the luminous ether and caloric fluid and all that sort of stuff. It should be thought of as a scientific theory, a theory that aims to give causal explanations of various phenomena, but it should be thought of as one that is dated and archaic, one that we should get rid of. Not just of its explanations, but of its ontology. And we've already talked about that. I'm not gonna rehearse that again very much. Now, there's a number of moves that you can make. Oh, and remember Churchland's the basis of Churchland's accusations that these are bad sciences, bad accounts. That folk psychology is bad science and offers bad accounts. He brings a few things to bear, but there are two sort of major ones. One is that its explanations are both very limited and very stagnant. That is that it used to be that we would appeal to folk psychological states to explain all natural phenomena, as in the ancient world. Why did the rock fall down? Well, because it wanted to get where it was going. I mean, that really is how ancient peoples thought of the behavior and movements of inanimate objects. But now, we only use folk psychology to explain human behavior, and so its whole domain of explanation is shrunk. In addition to that, its explanations of human behavior have not advanced. The belief desire psychology of today is the same as, if I was to tell you in 300 BC that little that little Athenian Johnny went to the agora, to the public meeting place, and you asked why, I said, well, he believed there were going to be girls there and he wanted to meet girls. It's exactly the same kind of explanation as the one I'm giving for middle school Johnny's behavior now. And Churchland sees that as saying, not only has the explanatory domain of folk psychology shrunk, but the explanations have not improved any. The folk psychological explanations of 2020 are the same that you would have gotten in 300 BC. So that's one line of critique that Churchland pushes, a main line of critique, and the other, that's the bad science line of critique. And the other is that folk psychology fails to be a part of what is an emerging scientific consensus about human nature, of which human behavior is a part. So all the other sciences, all the natural sciences, right? So everything from physics to chemistry to biology to biological anthropology, all of these are sort of converging on a common picture of human nature, and the folk psychological stands outside of it, right? And the reason it stands out of, the indication that it stands outside of it is that it doesn't reduce to it or otherwise cohere with it. Now, at this point, there are a number of directions we can take. I want to sketch some of them out. I want to give you a sense of the one that I not only prefer, but that I've been pursuing in my own work. Then that's going to wrap this up. Okay, and along the way, I'm going to employ that one example that you find in the Putnam essay. So here's one thing you could do. You could just sort of stand. You could just sort of stand your ground. You could reject. You could say, folk psychology is science. It's good science. There's no reason to drop either its ontology or its explanatory framework. And you might do this simply by saying to Churchland, look, what you're calling explanatory failures of folk psychology are things that folk psychology never intended to explain to begin with. That folk psychology really is interested in we employ folk psychological explanations when we are trying to understand mostly mundane, common, ordinary behaviors within the frame of ordinary language and speech and understandings. Right? That is, we employ folk psychological accounts with regard to sort of the everyday run-of-the-mill behaviors that we all engage in with and see others engaging in and seek to understand. We don't use folk psychology to understand perception. We don't use folk psychology to understand mental illness, and especially not profound mental illness such as psychosis. We don't use folk psychology to understand how memory works. And given that we look to folk psychology to explain run-of-the-mill, ordinary daily behaviors that in ordinary language and in terms and in a frame of reference that can be understood without technical expertise or special training. Because that's the case, it's not particularly surprising that the explanations don't change much from one year to the next, because, aside from massive changes in culture and civilization and learning and everything, the reason why kids go out to socialize is basically the same as they ever have, right? And so it's not like some great shock that the folk psychological explanations don't change very much. And with regard to the complaint about the failure of folk psychology to reduce to the rest of science, to more fundamental sciences, or to otherwise cohere with the more fundamental sciences, one can simply reply to Churchland by appealing to the anti-reductionist literature that we've already gone through. You just throw fodder at him. Say, guess what, Paul? Nothing reduces to physics, including biology, including chemistry, even probably. Certainly not economics, certainly not, so that reductionism can't be some kind of, reasonable required expectation of something in order to be a science, right? And because there's nothing else wrong with folk psychology, the failure to reduce is not any sort of reason to get rid of it, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of that, again, is in service of standing your ground, by which I mean continuing to hold to the view that folk psychology is a science and that the explanations it gives should be thought of as causal and therefore scientific explanations. What I'm saying is, this is the way in which, if you want to retain that view, that Fodorian view, this is how you reply to Churchland. You first of all deny that children has given accurate account, a characterization of what folk psychology explanatory aims are, and B, and partly because of A, reductive failure is no evidence of anything. This is not the route I choose to go down. I could go through 100 reasons why. If you read all that material I sent you in links, you'll probably get a much better sense of why I choose to go this way. That might not come across here, but I'm really not interested. I'm not teaching philosophy of Kaufman. The view that I want to push in dealing with Churchland and some of the other issues that have come up here is a view that is a minority view in philosophy, but it is the view that we made a fundamental mistake in the 60s by going to the post-Wittgenstein Davidsonian picture, that we never should have claimed that folk psychology is a science in the first place, and we never should have claimed that folk psychological explanations are causal explanations. Okay. All right, so that's where I'm going to go. What about this Putnam? What about the thing that's in the Putnam essay, right? So let me just go through the example, okay? That Putnam, the one in the Putnam essay that I'm gonna employ. All right. So Putnam imagines that we have a board with various shapes cut into it, and then we have a bunch of pegs that are supposed to fit through the spaces in the board. And suppose that this is a very rudimentary version of this, and the board just has two shapes, it's got a square and a circle. And we just have one peg, and it's a round one, okay? Cylindrical peg. And I want to explain to somebody why the round peg fits into the round hole and does not fit into the square hole. Now, one thing I could do is I could give a quantum mechanical description of the peg. I could give a quantum mechanical description of the board and the hole. And then I could do a very complex quantum physical analysis of what happens when the round peg goes through one hole when it goes through the other. I could do that. In short, I could give a rigorously physicalistic account, meaning in the language of physics, right? And at the physics level of description. Here's another way I could explain it. I could say to you, come over here for a second, look at this. And I could hold up the round peg and I could say, look, you see, because the round peg is the same shape as the round hole, it fits through the hole in the sense that the sides of the peg don't touch any of the sides of the hole. But because the square hole is a different shape from the round peg, when I try to put the round peg through it, the sides of the round peg bump into the sides of the square hole. I could say that too. What I've done there is I've given you an explanation in terms of sort of observable, ordinary characteristics. That is, characteristics that are observable through ordinary means. Looking, smelling, feeling, tasting, etc. Now, Putnam wants to know which is the better explanation. Let's assume they're both true. Which is the better explanation? And Putnam says, obviously, the second explanation is the better explanation. And the reason why the second explanation is a better explanation is because it satisfies our reason for engaging in the for trying to understand in the first place. Right? The problem I'm interested in is not a problem that's expressible in quantum mechanical terms. The problem I'm interested in has to do with common experiences understood in common terms. Right? And since we're anti-reductionists, since we know that reductionism can't work, there's really no sense in which we can even claim that these are equivalent explanations. They may they both be true explanations, but they're very different kinds of explanations. They operate as explanations at very different levels of description, and they thus answer very different desires to understand. But if I'm explaining to a normal person, you know, perhaps somebody who's puzzled by this, right, trying to shove the peg in, and I don't understand what's going on. The quantum mechanical explanation, even if true, is completely irrelevant. It's not what the person's asking, really. It's not what he's trying to understand. He's trying to understand why objects of his ordinary experience and understanding, which is not subatomic particles, but pegs and boards. He's trying to understand why a number of things that happen in his ordinary daily experience are as they are, and he seeks to understand that in ordinary terms. And what I want you to think about in terms of this example is what it is we seek explanations, or let's say accounts, for. Right? Why do we want scientific accounts? Why do we want causal explanatory accounts? Why do we want to know people's reasons? Are those always going to be the same? Oftentimes, if I want to understand something that's at this level of description, at what level of description should the explanation be, given what I want to know? What what Putnam suggests, and what is suggested by Putnam's example, this is a rule of thumb. This is not something that's going to always be true, but this is a rule of thumb, that generally speaking, explanations should be either horizontal or maybe one level below. Explanations rarely should be 10 levels below. I'm not saying a quantum level analysis is never relevant to understanding common experience, but I am suggesting it's almost never relevant to explaining common experience, ordinary experience. Right. At the most, if I want to understand common ordinary experience, I might go one level down, which is what? The folk psychological level. Maybe at times I'd want to go down to the neurological. Even rarer still, the biochemical, but I mean, now you're getting to vanishingly almost never. And to the physics level and quantum mechanical level, I feel very safe to say never. It is never going to be the case that anything I want to know about what middle school boys do with regard to going to malls, whatever it is I want to know, is never going to require quantum mechanical level explanation. And that's a sort of a general point. Most of the time, at whatever level of description we have a phenomenon that we would like to explain, the relevant explanations, the useful explanations, the explanations that get at what we're after, are typically going to be at or slightly below the level of description at which the phenomenon is described. It will on rare occasions, go several layers low. It almost will never go down to the level of physics or to quantum mechanics. And the board and peg example is designed to sort of illustrate that general principle, a general idea. What I'm going to want to say, and this will be the last sort of part of this last lecture, what I want to say is that there are a whole range of purposes towards which, with regard to which we want to understand people's behavior, and that with regard to those aims, with regard to the reasons why we want explanations of people's behavior at the ordinary language level of description, that the reasons we want these explanations don't have anything to do with anything that I would call natural scientific. That what we want to know the stuff for has entirely to do with things that operate at the social, and specifically the legal and the moral levels of description. And that with regard to those, only the folk psychological types of explanations are or can be the relevant ones. That is, we seek out folk psychological explanations for behavior that we take to be in some way socially significant, sometimes legally, sometimes ethically, sometimes in other social dimensions. But the point is, it's socially significant activity that we seek to understand by way of folk psychological accounts. And I'm going to say folk psychological accounts are the only appropriate way in which to understand these socially significant phenomena. Okay. So let me give you, let me now keep working with my very silly middle school example to give you a sense of this. Right? Okay. And I'm going to introduce some more vocabulary. Folk psychological explanations, I'm going to argue, are not causal, but rather are, in a fundamental sense, teleological. Now, telos is the Greek word for purpose or function. And what I'm going to say is that whereas causal explanations are mechanical in nature, folk psychological explanations are fundamentally teleological in nature, right? Folk psychological explanations explain behavior by appeal to purposes, ends, E-N-D-S. Causal explanations are not. Causal explanations are in terms of materially sufficient antecedent conditions or events, right? Now, in what way are folk psychological explanations purpose explanations or teleological explanations? Well, the middle school example is very easy to illustrate this. Boy goes to the mall, that's the behavior. Right? He goes to the mall because he believes that there are girls in the mall and he very much wants to meet girls. Those are the reasons. Notice something though. Those reasons only explain the boys going to the mall given a certain conception of the boy's end or purpose or good. And you'll see these are all the same. So let me flesh this out. Okay. In these terms. Believing that there are girls in the mall and wanting to meet girls is only going to explain my going to the mall if it's also understood that I represent meeting girls as a good. That's the sense in which the explanation is teleological. The explanation only makes sense against the backdrop of a certain end that I have. It's because I represent meeting girls as a good. It's because meeting girls is my end, that upon believing that there'll be girls at the mall, I will then be led to go to the mall. Without that end, without the idea that Johnny represents meeting girls as a good, the stated reasons for his going to the mall explain nothing or account for nothing. If we're going to reserve the word explain for causes, then let's talk about accounts and accounting for. And notice what the reasons that I give do. They render Johnny's behavior intelligible from his point of view. Only if I understand that Johnny represents meeting girls as a good, do I then understand why he went to the mall. And notice that in understanding it, I am understanding that behavior from his point of view, for it is he that represents meeting girls as a good. Now, the question is, why would I want to know that? Why would I want to understand Johnny's behavior in these terms? Because look, I can give you something totally different. I can give you a complex neurophysiological analysis of everything that happens to Johnny prior to getting to the mall. In other words, I could give you a very precise causal explanation as to what made his arms and legs do all the things that they did that landed him at the mall. Doing that would be kind of like giving a quantum mechanical analysis of the board and the pegs, right? It would be telling me something, but really not what I wanted to know. What I'm suggesting is that what I want to know with regard to Johnny can only be answered teleologically, and therefore in folk psychological terms. And now the question is, well, why is that? What is it that you want to know, or what is it about Johnny's behavior that you want to be able to understand? Well, put very briefly, I want to understand his reasons for acting from his point of view. But why do I want to know that? Well, one reason I might want to do it is because it might be a crucial part of an ongoing moral dispute. So I'm going to make this example even sillier now. So now I'm Danny, and I'm Johnny's best friend. And Johnny and I had a play date. 13, maybe not a play date, whatever you call it at 13. All right. Johnny was supposed to come over, and we were supposed to spend all afternoon playing the new Atari games that I got. Yes, that's when I was 13. That's what you had. An Atari 2600 with the joystick with the one button. And play Space Invaders and Missile Command on it, and Asteroids. So I'd gotten, new games from my Atari 2600, and Johnny's my best friend, and I'm like, Johnny, I just got this, you got to come over. And he's like, cool, I'll come over. And we have plans, and he's going to come over this afternoon. Now suppose Johnny doesn't show up. I'm sitting there in my house. No Johnny. I'm holding on to the new games. I'm like dying to play them. And where's Johnny? And he hasn't come. Now, of course, there are no cell phones, so I can't text Johnny. So I call Johnny's house on an actual phone with like a curly cord, right? And I speak to Mrs. Johnny, Johnny's mother. And I say, Johnny's mother, where's Johnny? And she says, Johnny's at the mall. Oh, okay. Hang up. Now I'm mad. Johnny broke a promise to come meet me. I was looking forward to it. I was really into us playing the new Atari games together, and he just stood me up. So I'm very angry. I'm very upset. I have issues with Johnny. Imagine now Johnny comes home and calls me. 6 o'clock at night. He calls me, and I said, "Where the hell were you, man? You're supposed to come to my house. You stood me up. You ditched me. Why? Why'd you do it?" And he says, "I went to the mall." I said, "Well, what the hell did you go to the mall for?" And he says, "Yeah, I know. I'm really sorry, but I heard that Erica Cohen and all these." I'm just thinking of who were the hot girls in my middle school in 1980 or whenever the hell. Yeah, 80. Yeah, 1980. Oh, I'm so sorry. Erica Cohen and Denise Dimson and Jamie, whatever her face is. I heard they were going to be at the mall, and they're so hot, and I wanted to maybe have a chance to meet them and talk to them and hang out with them. And so I stood you up. I'm really sorry. All right, you get the drift, right? I am upset with Johnny, and I'm going to characterize this as silly as this is. I have a moral problem with Johnny. I think he's done something wrong. I'm inclined to condemn him for it and do whatever other sanctions follow from a moral violation, albeit a minor one, right? But for a 13-year-old, a major one, right? Or at least a 13-year-old who doesn't live in Rwanda, a major one, right? And so the first thing I want to know is I want to know why he did it. I want to know what he did it for, right? It's going to matter to me if I'm evaluating him morally and deciding how I should react morally to him. The first thing I need to do is to understand what he did from his point of view. Listen, I know what he did from my point of view, and what he did from my point of view was bad, right? Because he had agreed to meet me, come to my house. I represent coming to my house and hanging out and playing video games as a good, and he didn't. So first of all, I want to know, what is it that you're representing as such a good that it's worth overriding what I thought we both agreed was a good, which was getting together to play video games. Now he tells me, so now I at least understand his behavior from his point of view. I know that he went to the mall ultimately because he thought meeting girls was a greater good, of greater value than coming to my house to play Atari 2600. Now I then can decide, right? 13-year-old Danny can decide now, because 13-year-old Danny has certainly thought about girls. 13-year-old Danny is a fan of Erica Cohen and whoever else, right? So, Danny understands from his point of view why he did this. And now I can ask myself a bunch of things. I can say, okay, I think that, Johnny coming over and us playing video games is a good. But I also do think meeting girls, and especially hot ones, is a good. Um, and whether or not I decide to condemn him is whether or not I can bring myself to see the thing from his point of view. That is, whether I can see why you would value meeting girls more than hanging out with your boring friend to play okay video games, right? If we'd been 10, this would not have even been an issue because he wouldn't have valued meeting girls. At 10, we still hated them, right? Hated girls, I mean. Wanted nothing to do with them. But now we're at an age where the valuations are changing. Now, if I decide that, he's right, meeting girls is more valuable, is a greater good than playing Atari with your friend, which you can do anytime, I might decide that he doesn't deserve any moral condemnation. I might say, oh, I totally understand, man. Just do me a favor. Take me with you next time, right? Or I might decide, no, man. Friends are more important. Friends are always more important. Therefore, rejecting his valuation. So now, while I understand from his point of view why he did what he did, I'm going to condemn him for it because I don't accept the idea that the value that led him to do what he did, that fueled his reasons, is more important than the value we'd already agreed upon when we made the date. You see all the permutations of this. The point is, that entire discourse, what I just described, that entire set of considerations, thoughts, decisions as to what to do in terms of whether to punish somebody or not punish them for a moral offense, all of that is only possible in a frame of reference within which the action is described and understood in folk psychological terms. That's the point that Greenwood makes about that the very phenomenon of psychology in most cases are socially significant actions, not motor movements. I'm not interested in why your arms moved. I'm interested in why you stood me up. Now, standing me up did involve your arms and legs moving, but that's not the level of description I'm interested in the behavior. I'm interested in the behavior at the level of its social significance, which means it's moral, it's legal, and it's other social interactions with parts of the social space. So the entire discourse that I just described is only possible if the phenomena is described in ordinary language / folk psychological terms, and if the reasons are described that way, and if the relationship to the reasons are understood teleologically rather than causally. This is also why the free will problem is not a real problem. The free will problem is a problem that involves the observation that all of our movements are caused. Well, that's true. But when we're talking about actions and responsibility, we're talking in a teleological framework. We're not talking in a mechanical framework. So what I'm going to say is that folk psychological classifications, ontologies, and explanations, or accounts better, are constitutive of every dimension of social life. It cannot be characterized without them, and it cannot be understood outside of them. And so what I would say to someone like Churchill is, you so entirely don't grasp the purpose of folk psychology, and not only the purpose of it, but the unavoidability of it. Right? If you think we are ever going to no longer have this dimension, this frame of reference, this form of discourse, you're completely, you're not in the world with the rest of us, right? So that ultimately is the move that I'm going to want to make. I'm going to deny that folk psychology is a science. I'm going to deny that its explanations are causal explanations. I'm going to deny that reasons are causes. I'm going to say that this entire framework belongs to a different frame, is part of a different level of description. It all operates at the social level of description, and more precisely, it operates in all those areas of social reality that have a normative dimension. And if you want to say, what is one of the defining features of the social dimension of life, is I would say it is normative. It has a normative character. That is not true of nature. Right? The chemical level of reality has no normative dimension. Right? Normativity belongs at a much higher level of description, at the social level of description, at the level of description at which only beings who have reasons and ends exist. And that's people. So that's going to be my move with regard to the church lens, and that type of critique. And so, to fit it back into the sort of the very bare bones historical story I told you, really what I've just described, and those who are sympathetic to my views on this, what it really involves is a return to the pre-Davidson consensus. Saying we took a wrong turn in the 1960s. We had a much better understanding of both the folk psychological and the social prior to that huge paradigm shift. Right. All right, I hope this is comprehensible. I hope this made sense. And I hope it gives you something to think about. It is the last thing I'm going to say to you in terms of the material for this course. And you'll have an opportunity to ask me whatever you like about it on Thursday during our final live Q&A. All right, take care, everyone, and I'll see you in day after tomorrow. Bye-bye.